Hi, this is the first of two sessions that I did on an introduction. I'll say that right, an introduction to logic. And it was done on a Saturday morning to a group of about 30 people who tuned in. Our weather was really inclement here. And so we just thought that we would do it online. So this is an online presentation, seminar, if you will. And each session's about 40 minutes. I'm going to try to break them down into chapters so that you can see them a little bit at a time, but I hope that you would be able to tune into this. So here we go. The reason that I decided to do a seminar on logic was because I was asked to teach a course on logic. And when I started thinking about logic and the students I'd be teaching, I thought I really have to go and finesse things so that it is more approachable. And as I started to do that, I thought what would be a good thing to do is to do my next seminar on logic. So that's how we got here. I'm working on a seminar or maybe a group of seminars on worldview. And I started to think through what I would do on worldview that would be different than what I've done and how to be more concise and maybe get more of it complete, I guess is the right word for it, which is something that I'd like to do. And one of the things I started to do was look at logic. And you could see that one of my good friends from South Africa, Natalie, who's a terrific artist, I asked her to draw me an iceberg because some of the books or some of the things you read on worldview would tell you about worldview is what's beneath the surface, like an iceberg. And not knowing what's beneath the surface is what'll hurt you. And if I go back to the other slide just for a minute and say the question is what's wrong with the world and how did we get here? That's what I want to do. I don't know that I'll write it into any kind of book form. I think videos do a lot more and reach a lot more people than books do today. I don't know that we have that many readers. It's understanding how do we understand what people believe about life, which is their worldview. How do they grasp these things and how do we deal with them? I think that's probably the important part that I'd like to make sure I deal with. That is the subject of it, or the idea of it. And one of the things, this is where I was going, one of the things that I want to make sure that I deal with is this whole idea of logic and how logic is so much a part of critical thinking. And how we as people in the church are not critical thinkers. We don't think for ourselves. Someone said that it's more like people are more concerned about teaching people what to think rather than how to think. And I think it's an easy answer for us that we want to learn how to think. And that's where logic comes in. That's really where we deal with it. So that's what we want to deal with. We want to learn how to think about something, not just what to think, not just the party line. And that's not a political statement. That's actually a personal statement. We want to be able to think clearly about what it is we believe. And we'll see some of that when we look at logic. I started out by saying that there's no way that I can teach you what you need to know, everything you need to know about logic. I hope that out of this, you'll be spurred on to read some things, or at least watch some things, or learn some things. I'll show you a course that's being taught that I think might be something you would think of doing. I think it would be very helpful. But it's learning to do these things. So part of our problem, another part of our problem, is that we have a negative view of intellectuals. if you think about that term, intellectual, there isn't a positive thing about it. If you know someone who is an intellectual, I guess I would back up a step and ask the question, how would you know they're an intellectual? Are they just smart? Or are they someone that is educated? Or are they people who can think through things and see through things because they're using a part of their mind that many of us are not? And everything in culture, really, whether it is music or certainly the amount of videos that are out there, they don't help us think about life. They don't help us think about the big questions in life. What they do is they tell us what life is like. And certainly if you look at the advertisements that are on the air, I'm not sure we even use that expression anymore. If you look at advertisements, they're just telling you what to think. They're not telling you or helping you learn how to think. And it's so important for us. And if anything that I learned when I was in seminary was not how to think. I think I've always been more of a thinker than my comrades were, my fellow ministers and brothers I walk with. And it's something I've always done, but I never learned logic, that's for sure. But I see how important it is for us to think through things. And what we're dealing with in our culture is a whole population that is being told what to think, not how to think. And we're not able to discern between right and wrong, good and evil, what's going to lead us forward and what is really hurting us today. So those are some of the things that we want to do. And the statement on this slide, it's what's beneath the surface that will hurt you. It's true about icebergs, but it's also true about culture. That if we don't know how to get beyond the superficial things, the surface things, it's pretty common that we will run into it. Now, if I asked to chime in and say, how many of you have ever studied logic? I think knowing those of you who have already signed in, I know a few of you have done this, that is that you've studied logic. But when I go to a church, if I mention anything about logic and ask the question about whether or not people have ever studied logic, the people who respond are usually homeschoolers. They're usually the folks that do this. I'm just going to make one little adjustment. Yeah, so it's in homeschool, good homeschool, classical Christian education. I'm not sure if there are other ones that do as well, but generally, they're the ones who study logic, and that's where those things come from. Okay, so why should we study logic? Sorry, going the wrong way. These are verses that I think all of you know well. Jesus is asking someone, what's the greatest commandment? Or Jesus is speaking here, and he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, that's pretty clear. What God is saying there is that we need to love him with our whole being, with every part of our being. So this verse is just another one. It says, he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So we have one from Matthew, now we have one from Luke. And you get the picture that whenever the synoptics, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whenever they are repeating things, they're things that they really were impressed to see as important, that these things are important for us and important for us to hear and to learn, because, again, we find this here in Mark chapter 12. So Luke has it, Matthew has it, and here's Mark. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Now, there's a little bit of a change in the order of the words, but basically they're saying the same thing. Where are they getting this from? They're getting this from Deuteronomy. And this is what Moses is telling them in Deuteronomy 10, verse 12. He says, and now, Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all of his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul? So again, the picture is that they are calling, God is calling, Moses is calling the people of Israel to love God with their whole being. These repetition things of your heart, your soul, your strength, your mind is just telling us that our whole being has to love God. And we often think about, what does that mean for us to love God? I think learning logic is one of the things that we do, or learning how to think logically about things is one of the things we do to love God with our minds. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 says that we should put off, not be conformed to the culture, to this world, but we ought to have our minds renewed. And it tells us that we should have something renewed in our minds. In other words, we should think differently. And that could be just the idea of how to put off and put on, which was a common expression in the first century, especially among Romans. They talked about putting off old things and putting on new things. And most of the time it had to do with wealth, or it had to do with clothing. But Paul picks it up and uses it as an expression of putting on Christ, and talks about being renewed in the spirit of your mind. And this is where those verses come from. It's from Deuteronomy, which is one of the most important books in the Old Testament, because it outlines for us so many things that keep on going backwards, not hitting the right buttons. Okay, so here's a couple of books on logic, and I say books on logic plus one. I would say that the gold standard for books on logic is Peter Kraft's Socratic Logic. I don't know if I can get to show you this, what it looks like here. This is the cover. This is the third edition, or 3.1. And it is, as I mentioned, Kraft's book on logic it's the gold standard. It basically is. It's people who teach classical logic or traditional logic, this is what they use. This book is what they use, I should say. It's just an excellent source. And it can be done as a group study. It can be done personally. It's written that way. Peter Kraft really works at bringing philosophy, and especially logic, down to everyone's order. The thing that I like about Peter Kraft is that he deals a lot with metaphysics. And you could see how his book on logic deals with metaphysics. Actually, he teaches metaphysics in the first couple of chapters without you knowing it. You're basically seeing something about logic, about metaphysics, rather, in that. The other book is one called Traditional Logic, and this is by Scott Sullivan. And this guy on the cover here is Aristotle. So you have Socratic logic and then a picture of Aristotle. And traditional logic is basically Aristotle's logic. And I'll mention something about that in a minute or two. And it is, again, if I were to ask you who's done this, who's studied logic before, it probably was 50 years ago, because what started to become the idea of logic was something very different than traditional logic. Again, I'll get into that in a minute. This other book, this is the plus one, is called Logic and the Way of Jesus. So there's the title here. I'll give you a picture of it. Logic and the Way of Jesus. And it is good. The subtitle is Thinking Critically and Christianly. And it doesn't start out as being a book on logic, but he gets into it. And this is my take on this, that my take on all of this is that people are afraid to go back into Aristotle's logic, and they don't want to deal with metaphysics. And for those of you who aren't familiar with terms like this, metaphysics deals with what something is, the nature of something, whether it is alive or whether it's inanimate, it deals with nature's essences. In philosophy, they call it whatness. Whatness, Whatness, whatness. It's my Brooklyn accent that says what. It's whatness. So that's my perspective. That's what I gain from this, or what I see from this. This is what they don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with some things, and again, we'll get into this a little bit, and hopefully you'll ask some questions about it. I see Isa is online. Good morning, Isa and Nana. Hope you're all doing well. And Mike Scavone just said hello to us, so that's good too. Always good to see folks. So if those of you who watch or look at Frank Turek's videos or go to his site, crossexamine.com, you'll notice Frank has a whole thing on courses, and they're excellent. There's some great courses on there. There's actually one I'd like to take on that Craig Blomberg is teaching on the reliability of the New Testament. And I know some of you are thinking, like, why would you want to study this? When you get a chance to study with some real experts, you're always going to learn some things. I met Gary Habermas in my first module in SES. I took a week module on Introduction to Apologetics, and I had the great fortune of staying at Dr. Geisler's house and drive Gary to and from the class every night. We would also go get dinner before the class. So his choice, whatever he wanted to do for dinner, that's where we went. And I was just his chauffeur. I had really, before I met Gary, I had no idea who he was, who turns out to be the expert on the resurrection. And here I had a whole week with this man. In Frank's list of courses, there's this fellow called Greg Blomberg, where Gary the resurrection is really where he has spent, I would say, the majority, if not all, of his adult ministry life. I understand he's finishing up a 5,000-page tome on the resurrection that is supposed to be published sometime. I'm sure it's going to be about 5 volumes, big, thick things, where he has everything recorded. That's where you get when you get into these people. Well, one of the things that Frank has just coming up is a course called Train Your Brain. And it's written this is the student workbook. And it's Frank Turek and Shonda Fulbright, who works with Frank in doing some teaching. I don't know if she's at his academy that he does every summer. But this is the student workbook, and on the bottom it says 6th grade and up. So 6th grade is what, 12-year-olds? I know that I've looked through it, and I thought it's really well done. And it will give you a really good handle on this. And I believe it starts October 2nd, if I'm not mistaken, that they're doing a group study. Pardon me. So that's part of the coursework. And so I would just say, if you're interested in doing something like that, to look at crossexamine.org or .com. Crossexamine.org, I believe it is. And that's Frank Turek's website, and you'll see his courses that he offers that are all taught by really good men and women who know their stuff. And Shonda Fulbright, I believe, is not just a parent, but a teacher as well. So it's very well done, very well illustrated, and I would use a lot of this stuff if I would. I just got it on Thursday, I think, or Wednesday. I just got the teacher's guide plus this, and I thought, man, I wish I had it a couple of weeks earlier. Anyway, what do we do? I said this earlier, that traditional logic is really Aristotelian logic. And Aristotle wrote the book on logic, explained everything on it. And again, why people don't want this kind of logic is because they have to deal with metaphysics. Now, why is that important? Metaphysics proposes that the natures that are in things are universal. They're not things that are transient, or they believe that the whole idea is that there is a dog is a dog and never becomes anything else. Cats, same thing. Lions, same thing, even though a lion would be part of the cat family or the feline family. And we would see all these things. And somewhere after the scholastic, or the end of the scholastic period, which ended in probably the early 14th, late 13th, early 14th century, maybe the transition happened over a century or so, that if you've ever heard of Occam's razor, William Occam, he basically just didn't like the idea of absolutes or universals, and said that basically things don't have natures, they're just what we call them. And there's just a sliver of truth in that to derail the idea of universals. And once you lose metaphysics, you're stuck with this thing called epistemology, which is just how we know what we know. And the briefest way to look at this is, I don't want to teach metaphysics this morning, though we will touch on it, that things don't have natures in themselves, they're just what we call them. The truth of it is that we give concepts names. For instance, when you see a dog or a cat, your mind says something to you about, you apprehend that, you understand that thing as a cat. Now, that's the concept, and so we give it that term. What Occam did was he just basically cut the legs out of that and just said, no, they don't have any natures or essences. We just call them whatever we think we want to call them. And that's the way philosophy works. So what traditional logic does is it deals with metaphysics. It deals with the whatness of things, what something is, what's its essence, what's its nature. One of the things that came downstream from that is that God doesn't have a nature. God just has properties. Again, I think a lot of what epistemology does, people who just start with epistemology, is they make stuff up. That's my amateur view of reality. As it deals with these things we call metaphysics, or things that are, terms that are. Okay. What logic is, according to Aristotle, is logic studies reason itself. And reason is the ability to think through about certain issues, about whatever it is you're thinking about. And the more you learn how to think about things, your logic gets more perfected. And I said this in one of the things I wrote as an advertisement for this course, that everybody uses logic. It's whether or not you have good logic or not. This is part of the problem. So I'll repeat this statement in certain different ways, explaining what logic does, and hopefully it'll help you. And at one point, I'm going to get to 10 reasons why you should study logic. That's something that we will come to. It's the standard by which we evaluate rational thought. So again, our thoughts should be rational. And we want to see if what we're thinking is rational or irrational. Does it make sense? And one of the things about worldview, the way that this ties into worldview, is that a worldview is how you make sense of reality, how you make sense of what's real. So that's an important thing. And if you have questions, again, put a Q in front of it. If I'm losing you or said something that you want me to go back over and explain a little bit more, please put it in the comments so that we can deal with it. So logic is the study of the rules of right thinking. That's another way to look at it. We look at, are there rules for right thinking? Do we understand how to do that? Okay. And just keep coming back. Logic is a tool that helps us think about reality. And to me, that's one of the most important things, that we deal with reality. And we'll see, again, if you've heard me do this, you've heard me do it a number of times. Now, here's one that I think requires us a little bit more. Just had a question come up. I'll get back to that in a minute. Logic is not natural. What do I mean by that? What do we mean when we say logic is not natural? In the sense of things like the natural world, that would be very different, because the things in the natural world will pass away. Even if we look at just our bodies, we see that they will pass away. Logic doesn't run out of anything. It's always there. And I think it's one of the proofs for the existence of God, and that God is logical. Logic is always there. It never dissipates. It never gets weaker. It only gets weaker in our use of it, but it never gets weaker in ourselves. If we study logic and how to think about reality, if we see it's something that we use, logic is something that I would say is above nature. I don't know that I would say it's supernatural, because I think there's some things that may be tied to that we don't want to understand. This question came up before, and it said, define epistemology. Epistemology is how we know what we know. How do we know things? And if you lose the basis for what things are, then you have to come up with other ways that we know things. And this all deals with the whole study in philosophy, that we have at least two branches of philosophy, two general branches of philosophy. One of them would be what I would call moderate realism, and it's the most common sense philosophy that we have. The other one is analytic philosophy, which always asks questions about the meaning of words. So they're not dealing with natures, they're dealing with these things. When you get rid of metaphysics and stop looking at the nature of something or the essence of something, then you end up with just words that actually, by definition, don't have any meaning in themselves. They just understand. They just know. Let me just see the right way to say it. In analytical philosophy or analytic philosophy, all they're doing is, this sounds very unkind, they make stuff up. They never come to conclusions because they can't. They can't come to conclusions because they never know the nature of something. Again, as an amateur philosopher, an amateur Thomist, these are the things that I would say that I know about philosophy. And logic, for that matter. Okay, 10 things that logic can help you with. And being conscious of our time, because I think it'll go on. Okay, number 1, logic builds the mental habit of thinking in an orderly way. And you'll see how that works as we look at logic. It'll build a mental habit to help you think in an orderly way. Logic also is the power of proof and therefore persuasion. If you learn some of the simple things that we'll talk about this morning, it will show you the power of proof and therefore persuasion. Now, I know someone that I really enjoy reading, and someone that's a good friend of mine mentioned something in a blog that they wrote about not being able to talk to people who are irrational, people who don't want to be logical. And I know what the person is saying, but I don't agree with it. I think you can always call people to their senses. And of course, if the fool is enjoying their folly, the scripture tells us, don't argue with them. And that is on them, not on us. But it also says that answer a fool, not according to their folly, but according to wisdom. And you might convert them, you might move them along. And I think that when you have proof for things, and we talk about facts, and rather than feelings, or we talk about personal truth, this, what people call personal truth, we'll see how that works for us. Okay, this next one is logic will give you the power to read any book. If you haven't read Mortimer Adler's classic book called How to Read a Book, that should be put on your list of reading. Yeah. Logic will give you the power to understand things that you don't think you understand or think that it's above your head, because you start to think sequentially and you start to build this habit of thinking right about things, and it'll give you the ability to do that. Now, I'm sure that there's some technical manuals that you wouldn't find any interest in, and starting or finishing doesn't do anything for you. But I think in general, this is a very true statement. This is what logic will do for you. It'll also help you write. Clear thinking helps you write clearly. I know this for a fact. I learned how to write very differently when I was in seminary, even though I had written for a magazine we used to publish, different things that went on, but I really learned how to write and how to write papers that were academic papers, that some of them have been published. Some of them have been published into the seminary's periodical. And I would never have thought that I would be someone who could write something academically to do that, but I'm sure it's because my ability to think more clearly about things. Faith is an important thing. Logic can help you decide true and false doctrines. It can help you see what is meaningful and what is not meaningful. And this is part of our problem, is that the church does not regard being an intellectual or being able to think this way as something that's important, that we want to be just led by the Spirit, but not think for ourselves about things. And this is how false doctrines come into play. And so what logic does is it can help us ascertain what is true or what's good theology and what's bad theology. It certainly can do that for us. It can't make you wise, but it can help you. Logic by itself doesn't make you smart or wise, but it can help you. And being smart and being wise are not the same thing. The old adage is, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. A little difference between the two. Logic helps us test authority. Everyone needs authorities. We all use authorities, but we need to test them and be able to test them to see that whether or not they are good authorities, whether they are meaningful. We'll all point to something so-and-so said, or this is what they said, and is the authority really credible? Or is it just because they're important or have a position of importance? Well, logic can help us see these things. And this certainly deals with the whole political realm that we're dealing with today. Can we test authorities? Can we look at all the different views that people have and be able to do this? Yeah. Okay, Vaughn, you have to be a little bit clearer. Good one on what? Just saying. I know there's a little bit of a lag between the video and things coming up on the comments screen. Okay, recognize contradictions. Recognize what those things are, things that are not in agreement with each other, and how to separate them, and recognize what the good is and what the evil is or the bad is. And we can do those things. All right, number 9. That's number 8, actually, to help us define terms. And we'll look at that. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. Certainty. Oh, okay. The fruit salad. Gotcha. Certainty. The principles of logic are unfailingly true. If you use them correctly, they will help you be certain about something, especially when we look at the difference between inductive and deductive syllogisms. When we put together an argument, they can, when you use them correctly, they work really good. Okay. And the last one is, logic can't tell you what's true, but it will help you discover it. And here probably is one of the most important ones, and purposely left for last, is that you know that I define it, and it's not my definition. This is Aristotle's definition. I don't even know if he's the one who discovered it, but certainly he's the one that penned it. And we're going back 2,500 years to Aristotle's idea or his concept of truth, and saying that to say that something is and it is that thing is true. And to say that it is but it's not, that's false. Now, I'm paraphrasing what he said, but basically it came down to this statement that we say that the correspondent theory of truth is that truth has to match or relate to authority. If we make a truth statement, it has to correspond to what's real. If it doesn't correspond to that, then it's not true. Today, that's almost turned around. Again, you go back to epistemology and the whole idea of words don't have the kind of meaning that they're supposed to have because things don't have a nature. Now it's not truth. A truth statement has to correspond to reality. Reality has to correspond to the statement, so that we come up with the ideas of transgendering things, that people don't see the reality of what biology and the facts of biology have said, but now they make it mean something else. Gender doesn't relate to biology. That's what we're dealing with in the culture today. That we could even go as far as say that psychology is trumping biology. Okay. It's a good place to stop and look at a question here. This is from Claudia. And she says, logic has always existed because it's God's nature. But man discovers logic through the intellect. He didn't invent logic. Yeah, correct. Atheists will say that logic evolved in man. Probably, because they can't. It's one of the things, do you understand the question that she's asking? That logic is when I said that it's not natural, it's something that is always here. If all the trees die on the planet, if all the animals die on the planet, logic will still be alive. It will still live. It will still be here. Things will be logical. Logic and math are such close cousins or close siblings that math is built on logic. Mathematics is built on logic. And the way that you do anything correctly in math is by knowing the logic behind it. And math isn't something that evolved with humanity, if that's what the atheists or the evolutionary atheists believe. Logic has always been here. We discover it. The same way the Greeks did not discover logic or not invent logic, they discovered it. They realized, and they did that because the earliest philosophers were naturalists in this sense. They wanted to know why the sun rose and why you could time it. It started with a man called Thales, who, studying the heavens, predicted a solar eclipse. Now, this is 500 years before Jesus. So we're looking at probably 2,700 years ago or so, whatever it is, 2,500 years ago. Without telescopes as we know them or anything else, Thales basically could predict when the sun would be blotted out by the moon because of the movement of the stars, and he did that mathematically. That was already here. They didn't invent it, they discovered it. And it helped them understand so much about life because of it. And basically, the Greeks were the ones who understood how logic works. Not all the Greeks were involved with their pantheon of gods. Some were very interested in the academic side of life, and that worked really well for them. Okay, got a few more minutes. I just want to deal with some of the things that are here. It was Peter Kraft who said this, that truth is its own end. Let me take this off so you can see it clearly. Yeah. Truth is its own end, and truth perfects the mind when you embrace it. It actually brings virtue into your life when you embrace it right. Truth is an end in itself, and it should be our pursuit. I don't want to beat that wagon too hard or too much right now, but we want to see this. Once you lose epistemology, you lose truth. And that's what happened to during the whole postmodern period. I think postmodernism still affects us, but it was a denial of universals. It was a denial of absolute truths. No one could be absolutely right. I was going to do an experiment, a thought experiment with you to talk about what truth is and how truth works. And what I was going to do was I have an egg that I travel with all the time, and do this idea that if I take this egg, you can't see it, but just believe that I'm going to do this. I'm going to take this egg, and if you could watch me, I'm going to put it in my pocket, right? And what do we know about this egg now? What do we know about the statement that the egg is in my pocket? What is it that we know about it? How do you know it's in my pocket? What is the truth about it? And if I did this with a pen and I put it on the podium and said, how do you know the pen's on the podium? If you say, I saw it, I saw you put it on the podium, or if we look at the egg and we say, I saw you put it in your pocket, does that make it true? What if you didn't see me put it in my pocket? What if you didn't see me put the pen on the pulpit? Would it still be true that the pen is on the pulpit? In other words, does it depend on you seeing something to make that thing true? Or is it just true because that's where it is? Whereas the location of the pen or the location of the egg. What we do is we think that it's true because we see it or because we believe it. That makes it true. But objective truth and the things that we call natures, it doesn't matter what we call them. It doesn't matter whether we believe in them. It's true whether we believe in it or not. And that is how truth works. So we have to see it that way. I want to make sure I get all the questions here. Here's a good question from Brian. Brian says, I want to get this a little bit higher. Do you think that postmodernism has influenced a decline in applied logic and acceptance of objective truth? Absolutely. Absolutely. Postmodernism basically was a denial of several things. It's a rejection of modernism, and I'm not an adherent to modernism. I don't think modernism did everything that it was supposed to do. And in that sense, I agree somehow with some of the postmodern thought. But they rejected absolute or objective truth. They said no one has the truth, and we'll look at that later on this morning. And it's perhaps the most serious denying that truth exists, that objective truth exists. Postmodernism is pernicious. It's one of the worst doctrines, one of the worst beliefs that has ever come along because of what it's done. Yeah. It's one of the worst things that's ever come along because, again, if a proposition that is true must correspond, in other words, a truth statement must correspond to reality, once you lose that, now truth becomes anything you want it to be. And we'll look at that in a little bit, too, about your truth and my truth and what those things are. Okay. Here's a few things we want to look at. Objective truth, subjective truth, fallacies, and what they are. So that's the end of the first session that I did Saturday, the 23rd of September. And I will post this next part as soon as I can. I hope you do look for it and trust that it is something good. Thanks for tuning in, and please don't forget to subscribe.